G'day everyone. So school zones are back in force this week. Holidays are over, it's back to school. My kids are thrilled with it. So that means that streets like this will be 40 kilometres an hour between 7 and 9 AM and 2 to 4 PM. And we all know why school zones are important. Kids are unpredictable. Parents are dropping them off outside the school gate. There's lots of movement around. And as we know, the slower a vehicle is going, the less risk that there's going to be serious injury or death in the event of a collision.
The reality is the state government builds state schools on main roads with very few facilities for parking.
Side note, but imagine thinking the problem with school zones was not enough car parking. Seriously.
And conveniently, outside Centenary State High School, there is a slow for Sam monitor which tells us when people are exceeding the speed limit, which is currently 50 kilometres an hour. So these people who are going past at 53 kilometres an hour or thereabouts, they do that as of Tuesday during 7 to 9, which is the time now, then that's a $464 fine. Pretty steep, but a small price to pay for keeping our children safe, I would say. If you're a follower of my channel, you'd know that I'm a huge advocate for 30 kilometres an hour speed limits. And to me, a 40 kilometre an hour speed limit for school zones is ridiculously fast. But that's the law we've got. And we've got to rely on motorists, whether they're parents or just members of the local community, to obey by those rules. Of course, we all know that people driving aren't terribly good at just following the rules and paying attention to road markings and so on, so sometimes it's important to shove it in your face what you've got to do, and that's why Slow for Sam is a good feature. So g'day, I'm Chris. This channel is pretty much about urban cycling and cycling for transport with a very Brisbane flavour, but I think much of what I talk about probably applies to other cities, so hope you like what I'm doing here, and if you do, don't forget to subscribe. This is the Kurilpa Bridge. It's a pedestrian and cycle bridge that links South Brisbane to the CBD. At the southern end you have the Kurilpa Point Bikeway, which links Riverside Drive to West End and the South Bank Boardwalk to, well, South Bank. And at the northern end you have a two-way protected bikeway that links down to George Street, which also has two-way protected bike lanes, and you can cross the Court Precinct and across Roma Street up towards the North Brisbane Bikeway. It's a very well used bridge, and last time counts were done, it was about 3,500 people during weekdays. It was October last year, and on weekends it was about 2,000 to 2,500. More than half the users on this bridge are pedestrians. As you can see from the layout, there's no dedicated cycle lanes or pedestrian sections on the bridge, it's just a shared path. But what is unusual about this bridge is that it has a 10 kilometre an hour posted speed limit. In most parts of the world, speed limits aren't usually enforceable for bike riders, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, bikes are not required to have a speedometer, so it's generally considered a bit unfair to penalise cyclists for speeding if they don't have a way to know how fast they're travelling. And secondly, the risk presented by a cyclist travelling too fast is far lower than that of a motor vehicle. That's basic physics. A 100 kilogram bicycle and rider has far less momentum and therefore impact than a 2-ton car at the same velocity. Now before you chime in saying a bike hitting a pedestrian can kill someone, yes, that is true, but it is exceedingly rare. While on average 140 pedestrians are killed by motor vehicles each and every year in Australia. Risk assessment includes likelihood, and being killed or seriously injured by a cyclist is extremely unlikely. But here in Australia, and particularly in Queensland, we love our laws that clamp down on active transport. Now, putting aside the fact Australia has enforceable bicycle speeding laws, what about this limit of 10 kilometres per hour? Does it make sense? The Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads has a helpful guide called Speed Management on Shared Paths, dated August 2020. The Kurilpa Bridge is, of course, a shared path. I particularly like this chart, which shows the relative speeds of various path users, with cyclists averaging between 16 and 25 kilometres per hour. So a bicycle is expected to be able to comfortably and safely travel at a minimum of 16 kilometres per hour. Why would you impose a speed limit of 10 kilometres per hour?
Curious.
In fact, the guideline states that enforceable speed limits are not even viable. Since bicycles are not required to have a speed measuring device, and many do not have one, mandatory speed limits and their enforcement are not a viable option, even if they could be enforced. However, advisory speed signing and warning signage on paths where there are large numbers of slower users can be effective when used selectively at appropriate locations and in accordance with the prevailing conditions. A review of national and international literature has demonstrated speed limits for people riding bikes are not used or recommended as a safety device, with the exception of the rule which states that the speed limit of the adjacent roadway shall apply to any road-related area. So what that last bit means is that unless signed otherwise, the general speed limit for a shared path or cycleway is the same as the attached road. Or if there is no attached road, then the default speed limit of 50 km/h applies. Of course, that doesn't mean that travelling at 50 km/h on a shared path on your bicycle is safe. Speeding is not the same thing as riding or driving too fast for the conditions, a concept few people seem to understand. More importantly, the guidance says that on well-designed paths and in good conditions, people riding bikes can travel comfortably at speeds of between 15 and 25 km/h with minimum risk or decrease in amenity for people walking.
I just want to look at this bridge. I see it's wide, there's good sight lines, it's straight, pretty much all movements are just one way or across or the other. There's not like there's lots of people going across the path. It's a fairly gradual slope. There's a spiral down at the southern end that lets you get down to ground level. There's nothing here that indicates why it needs to be 10 km/h.
The guidance also talks about bicycle operating speeds and notes that under 11 km/h, riding a bicycle can actually be unsteady. Studies of bicycle operational stability during the last century have shown that a bicycle can become unstable at speeds below 11 km/h. The degree of stability depends on a number of factors: the skill of the rider, the design of the bicycle, and environmental factors such as path surface and slope. Requiring people riding bikes to travel at speeds which may detrimentally affect their stability and safety on inadequately designed paths, shared with other users insensitive to their operational needs, is not an equitable or safe path management strategy. Any regulatory device which instructs people riding bikes to undertake a behaviour that will compromise their safety cannot expect compliance and damages the credibility of the device and should be replaced with a more suitable treatment. Okay, so this guidance came out in 2020. Maybe these devices on the Kurilpa Bridge predate it. Well, no. This was the street view in November 2021, showing the speed sign as 20. This sign has been changed since then. The pavement markings have said 10 km/h for a long time, but those are advisory and not enforceable. Queensland road rules state that an enforceable limit is one with a number in a red circle. So what gives? If the Department of Transport and Main Roads has these guidelines in place for shared paths, and this is a state government-owned bridge, why haven't they applied their own standards? And that's where the wonders of state government bureaucracy and inter-department cooperation come into play. The Kurilpa Bridge and the Goodwill Bridge, another pedestrian and cycle bridge in the area, notably signed at 20 km/h, are assets owned by the Department of Energy and Public Works. Clearly, they don't pay attention to what the Department of Transport and Main Roads, who are the subject experts on active transport, have to say about one of their assets whose purpose is for active transport. Anyway, this is all just a fuss about nothing, right? As the guidelines said early on, mandatory speed limits for cyclists and their enforcement are not a viable option, even if they could be enforced. That implies that the speed limits aren't enforceable, right? Well, someone should tell the Queensland Police Service under the guidance of another state government department, the Department of Police and Corrective Services. Yeah, another minister.
As police target rogue riders breaking the law.
You're overtaking everyone on the bridge. We're enforcing speed limits, helmets, and poor rider behaviour.
A holiday road safety crackdown now honing in on e-scooters and bikes.
Stop.
This morning's blitz saw 4 people fined for failing to wear a helmet, 11 caught for speeding, 1 travelling almost 20 kilometres over the limit.
What? Almost 30 km/h?
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
You're vulnerable, not just in relation to the speed you're travelling at, but the locations you're travelling at, in and amongst pedestrians and road users.
A reminder, road rules are for everyone.
While the blitz in this story was focused on e-scooters, cyclists who were found exceeding this not viable shared path speed limit were being ticketed too. And what's the fine? $464. Remember when I was talking about school zones and those drivers who were going past the sign in excess of 50 km/h? Well, if they do that while school zones are enforced, so 11 to 20 km/h over the limit, $464.
Say what?
Yeah, that's right. If you drive your 2-ton fully loaded ute through a school zone at 53 km/h, you can get the same fine as someone riding a bicycle on the Kurilpa Bridge at 23 kilometres per hour, within the recommended safe and comfortable guidelines for cycling on a shared path. This kind of punitive enforcement serves only to discourage people from using smaller, more sustainable forms of transport like bicycles and e-scooters, without making any difference or benefit for safety. Now, if you're watching this with a bit of a libertarian mindset, you're probably thinking, oh yes, quite right, equal fines for equal crimes. But these are simply not equal offences. The risk you present to other people when you drive your car at 53 kilometres per hour is far, far higher than the risk of someone riding a bicycle at 23 kilometres per hour. And it didn't used to be this way. There used to be different weightings for bicycle and motor vehicle offences. That changed, ironically, as a result of the Queensland Parliamentary Inquiry into Cycling in 2013, which said, the committee supports increasing current infringement penalties for cyclists set out in Schedule 3 of the State Penalties Enforcement Regulation 2000, so that equal penalties apply to all road users for those Queensland road rules where the potential to endanger others is greatest, including the following rules. Section 20, obeying speed limits, etc, etc. Of course, while a lot of the recommendations in that report were ignored by then Transport Minister Scott Emerson, under the command of the most authoritarian self-titled libertarian you could imagine, Campbell Newman, this recommendation was wholeheartedly supported and implemented immediately. Establishing uniformity of penalties for all road users is consistent with the underlying concept of equal responsibility for road safety in the committee's report.
This concept of equal responsibility for road safety applying to all road user types is, in my view, complete nonsense when the level of risk caused is nowhere near comparable. The idea that someone on a bicycle exceeding a completely nonsensical 10 km/h speed limit is the equivalent of someone in a ram going at 50 km/h through a school zone is just a sick joke. The normalisation of cycling penalties with motorist penalties was a really bad decision, and I'm calling on Minister Mark Bailey to start the process to undo that. Penalties should be relative to risk, and it should recognise that if you've got more power, mass, speed and momentum, then you have more responsibility for others' safety. And yes, a cyclist or scooter rider has more mass, speed, power and momentum than a pedestrian, and so we have to take more responsibility around pedestrians. But is it the same level of responsibility as someone driving a fully loaded Ford Ranger, which probably just means one person, through a school zone with kids around? I don't think so. As a cyclist or scooter rider, we fulfill our responsibility in shared zones by treating people walking as we want to be treated. Slow down, give them plenty of room, and just be a little bit human. We don't need an arbitrary and completely unenforceable and unrealistic speed limit applied on shared paths to try and do that.
As for Queensland Police, this kind of safety theatre is not about safety. It's about public relations. Media like Channel 7 love to fan the flames of bike and scooter hate, and you jump on the bandwagon to distract from the things that are making you look bad. Now, I'm not saying there are no cyclists and scooter riders who behave recklessly and dangerously around other path users. There are dickheads no matter what the mode of transport. But address that. Do it with on-foot and on-bike patrols and pull up the people you witness putting others in danger and behaving stupidly. Blitzes like this on people not actually causing any danger only undermines confidence and trust in policing. If you were really concerned about pedestrian safety, you would focus on the main cause of that danger, and that's motorists, not bicycles or scooters. This is a map showing all the pedestrian crashes with bicycles in the city and South Brisbane in the past 20 years. And this is showing all pedestrian crashes with cars in the same period. Oh, and what about the Kurilpa Bridge itself? There's not been one reported pedestrian crash on that bridge in the entire time that it's existed. Not one. The message to the Queensland Government is simple. Get rid of this ridiculous 10 km/h speed limit on the Kurilpa Bridge. Your own Transport Department guidance shows that it's wrong. Do it tomorrow. Minister Bailey, it's time for you to undo Recommendation 31 from that 2013 cycling inquiry. Penalties for cycling infringements simply should not be the same as for motor vehicles. I'm not saying cyclists should not be accountable for breaking the law, but the penalties need to fit the risk created. A cyclist going 11 km/h over the limit on a shared path is not in any way the same thing as a driver going 11 kilometres per hour over the limit in a school zone. The penalties just don't fit the crime. The punitive enforcement of nonsensical rules based on an irrational fear of bicycle and e-scooter threats to pedestrians, while completely overlooking the real and decades-long harm that cars have caused to pedestrians, is the pinnacle of car culture. While cars kill over 100 pedestrians every year nationwide, we either see sensationalist stories like this blitz on cyclists and e-scooters on the Kurilpa Bridge, or we have an equally sensationalist story about pedestrians daring to cross the road on a red pedestrian light, or away from crossings, or looking at their phones. We constantly ignore the massive elephant in the room. Cars are literally killing us. Slowing them down, limiting conflict points between cars, pedestrians and cyclists, and, most important of all, reducing the amount of trips taken by car are all far more effective solutions to improve pedestrian safety than blitzing a bloody shared path bridge in the middle of the city. If you see stories like this, you should get angry. Not at people on bikes or scooters, but on the so-called media putting this garbage out and the ministers who encourage this kind of public relations safety theatre to distract from the many real public safety issues we face on our roads and in our communities, and which they are utterly failing at addressing. No, I'm not saying cyclists and scooter riders should not be accountable for their actions. Of course we should. And there needs to be penalties in place. But those penalties need to be reasonable and just and applied with some semblance of discretion and focusing on those behaviours that put people at genuine risk. Blanket enforcement of silly speed limits that don't comply with best practice and other stupid cyclist-specific laws like having to have a bell or wear a helmet accompanied with significant punitive fines is not how you encourage people to use these more sustainable, smaller, efficient and safer forms of personal transport. It just keeps people in cars, and that maintains the source of almost all the danger for pedestrians.
Well, what do you think? Do you feel safer as a cyclist knowing that the police are out there blitzing us for minor little things like this? Is living in a police state fun? Let me know in the comments. Cool, comments could be fun on this one. If you enjoyed this little rant of mine, make sure you give the video a like. And if you like these kinds of rants, subscribe, there might well be more. And if you want to contribute to my legal fund in case vengeful police are out looking for me after this video, hit the link to buy me a coffee. Well, that's all I got. Ride safely, drive rarely, and I'll see you out on the bikeways riding perfectly legally, right? Ciao, ciao.
As police target rogue riders breaking the law.
You're overtaking everyone on the bridge. We're enforcing speed limits, helmets and poor rider behaviour.
A holiday road safety crackdown now honing in on e-scooters and bikes.
Stop.
This morning's blitz saw 4 people fined for failing to wear a helmet, 11 caught for speeding, 1 travelling almost 20 kilometres over the limit.
You're vulnerable not just in relation to the speed you're travelling at, but the locations you're travelling at, in and amongst pedestrians and road users.
A reminder, road rules are for everyone.